one king and one land is peace. Two kings in one land is war.
Rise now. Where we have failed, we will try again.
They will hunt him like dogs.
We are fighting for our lives! Our wives! Our children! And the freedom of our country!
At the turn of the 14th century, Scotland is a land without a king. England's brutal King Edward I claims the country as English territory, crushing the brave heart of Scottish rebel William Wallace. In the face of English occupation, two men are clashing over their visions of Scotland's future. Both desperately want the reins of power. Robert the Bruce, a renegade noble whose ancient ancestor was king. And John Comyn, a Scottish lord with royal blood on both sides of his family. They agree to meet here to discuss a truce.
Your weapons?
Have you any other weapons?
John Comyn is the man, and I'm sure he wasted no opportunity in making sure that Robert Bruce knew that. These two young men are both very, very ambitious and certainly did not get on.
Comyn struck a bargain to support the English king. The deal turns Bruce's stomach.
He disemboweled Wallace.
He is the king.
Not of our land.
Who would be then?
I am.
If Bruce wanted peace, he's failed miserably. He wants to be king. Now he's an outlaw.
This was the worst possible start for anybody who was trying to make it to the kingship of Scotland. It was an absolute disaster. And if you're going to murder somebody, you certainly do not do it at the altar of a church.
It's Comyn dead!
I'll make sure.
You'll be excommunicated for this, Bruce. Edward's men will hunt you down. Be the king of outlaws.
The murder in the church puts Bruce in the crosshairs of an English king looking to trample the Scots once and for all.
Edward I is not going to have any sympathy with this.
This is the beginning of a life on the run for Robert the Bruce.
He'll be a hunted fugitive. He has no choice whatsoever but to go for a bid for the throne now. It's now or never. It's either that or he's going to die. It's as simple as that.
So he does what any sensible man at the time would do. He goes to visit Robert Wishart, the Bishop of Glasgow.
Bruce will find no forgiveness from the English king. So he turns to a higher authority.
Robert Wishart, who's long argued for Scotland's independence, he says, well, there's only one thing you can do, and that's declare yourself king now. At least as king, you can call out people on behalf of the national cause.
The Catholic Church wields power above any monarch. The bishop decides to crown Bruce himself. In the eyes of the English, Robert Bruce is a murderer, marked for death. But by calling himself King of the Scots, he becomes a freedom fighter in the eyes of his countrymen.
The inauguration at Skene wasn't quite the event that I think that Robert Bruce would have hoped in his mind.
When Edward I had come into Scotland, he took with him the Stone of Destiny on which Scottish kings were inaugurated. How do you actually inaugurate a king if you don't have the essential equipment present?
Even though this is a spur-of-the-moment decision that is taken in the aftermath of the murder, Bruce has a good deal of support. I mean, remember, he is one of the two families who have a very, very powerful claim to the throne.
But he has got to waste no time in letting everyone know that he is the top man.
You can't just declare yourself king. The Scottish throne is built on ancient allegiances, superstition, and ceremony. For centuries, Scottish kings have been crowned by one clan, the Macduffs. Isabella Macduff has decided to support Bruce's claim.
Take me to Bruce.
You'll fight with us?
I'll do more than that.
And so, a second coronation for the would-be king.
Well, you want as many things there and as many people there to make it look good. And that's why the presence of Isabella is so important.
It's really all about legitimacy. As has always been the case in Scotland, the king has a fairly shaky grasp on the nation. And it's important to get the support of the nobles and the landed families and the chiefs. You need to get them involved in a ceremony which accepts that he is the king. To get crowned by Macduff, as would still happen today if there were a king in Scotland, and to just be accepted as the leader of the nobles and really the first among equals.
Just having the tin hat put on your head does not make you king. Robert Bruce has got to make himself king in everybody's mind. And if that means he's gonna get crowned more than once, he gets crowned more than once. He is able to build an alliance of landholders, relatives, and people who all want to see him rule Scotland because it would benefit them.
Of course, just because Robert Bruce has been inaugurated as king doesn't mean that Scotland is in any way his to rule. Of course, it's still run by Edward I, as it has been since 1304. And making himself king is more about getting over the murder of Comyn, or at least helping him to get over the murder of Comyn, and giving him a platform, if you like, from which to begin the reconquest of Scotland.
He might be king, but Bruce is still a wanted man. He sends his family north to safety. But word of the murder in the church reaches the English king before the women and children arrive. Edward I's men, led by his son, Edward II, put a price on the head of Bruce and everyone he loves. No Bruce is safe anywhere. Everybody's got a price. The English have found a man in the castle willing to switch sides.
He wants gold.
Bruce is king of traitors.
What do we give him then?
Well, he's so weak. Give him all he can carry.
The guard who's looking after the castle sets fire to a grain store.
The castle burns to the ground. Robert the Bruce's family and Isabella Macduff flee into the night. They run to a church, St. Duthuc's Abbey, hoping for safety in its sacred walls.
We cannot violate the sanctuary.
Of course we can.
The king, Edward I, was not going to make any exceptions.
Edward's troops slaughter the Bruce men, including his brother Nigel. The women are captured and enslaved.
His idea was come down as hard as possible on any of the Bruces that you could find. Poor Nigel was exactly drawn at the back of horses and then hung. The idea of hanging at this period was not to break your neck with hanging, it was to hang you until you suffocated, basically. And that would take a long time. It was a very cruel and painful death, and then you were quartered. Women who were associated with Bruce, captured by the English, including his wife, were humiliated.
Edward I wants to use the women to send a message.
What will you do with them?
Let her be closely confined in an abode of stone and iron. Let her be hung up out of doors in the open air at Berwick, that both in life and after her death she may be a spectacle, an eternal reproach to travelers.
They sent as a warning, this is what happens if you place the crown on the King of Scots' head.
It's not only the Bruce women that the English king wants to make an example of. The Judas who betrayed Bruce gets his greedy reward. All the gold he can carry.
Edward rewards the guard by giving him gold in the form of a molten gold poured into his throat. You know, you betray your own king, well, this is probably what you do to me.
Bruce's quest for the throne is destroying everyone around him. He retreats to Scotland's remote Western Islands.
He must have wondered, what have I done? I have brought down the wrath of God for what I have done, and it's been my family and my friends that have suffered.
For a long time, he was almost a man alone.
I think Bruce it must have been in hell, to be honest.
Bruce's life has lost all joy. A king in exile, a husband without his wife. He must choose, live as a fugitive, or fight for his crown and put himself on a violent collision course with the English king. Robert the Bruce's quest to become King of Scotland has cost him everything. He's a fugitive. His wife and children captured and enslaved. Every day Robert the Bruce hides, the oppressive English king hammers the Scots. Bruce wants Edward I dead, but he's powerless. Then fate intervenes and changes everything.
The king, he of England, is dead. The wicked son is to be crowned.
From mad king to hated son.
A bloody line of succession. He'll inspire no love or loyalty. He's nae a real king.
I am again.
Yes, my lord.
Rise now. Where we have failed, we will try again.
Edward I dies, and when Bruce hears this, he replies that he fears the bones of Edward I more than he fears the person of his useless son, Edward II. And while he was away, Bruce seems to have had a long think to himself about how can we make an impact?
He seems to have sat down and go, do you know what? Everything I've learned, everything I've known until this point, forget it. I am just going to throw the rule book out and work things out my way.
Robert Bruce makes himself the person he needs to be in order to be successful.
Robert's men learn to ambush and sabotage, destroying English strongholds, picking off Edward's landholdings across the Scottish countryside, and then disappear into the forest like ghosts.
And what he seemed to come up with was that he could never really match the English in fixed battle. In a set piece, he was likely to be defeated. So he had to come up with other tactics. He developed what we would now recognize as guerrilla tactics.
Ever since he's been on the run, hiding from King Edward's bloodhounds in the forests, fleeing to the Isles, he developed a form of guerrilla warfare. It was extremely successful, but was regarded as being very unconventional.
The old English king was feared and respected. The new English king is struggling.
Edward I had this fantastic military reputation. Edward II could barely control his own nobility.
Nobody trusts Edward II. Nobles whisper scandals about his relationship with his favorite aide and alleged lover, Piers Gaveston.
Edward II had a poor track record politically. He was already infatuated with his favourite, Piers Gaveston.
He has a rather dubious obsession with Piers Gaveston, a friend of his.
Well, I look forward to seeing it.
Because of the favouritism that Edward II squanders on Gaveston and gives him land and titles, why fight for a man who's not really seen to be fair?
The English nobles don't tolerate it for long.
Piers Gaveston is judicially murdered, I think would be the way to put it, by some of the most senior of England's earls. So obviously, Edward is absolutely devastated.
While Edward is battling insurrection at home, revolt ignites across the border in Scotland. For 5 years, Robert the Bruce wages a guerrilla campaign against the English occupation. He captures castle after castle, pulling them down stone by stone.
The Scots are very clever. They don't go out to just meet him head on. They actually take back or destroy these castles one by one.
He's taking back Scotland, piece by piece.
What do you have to do to beat the English in Scotland? You have to make sure that their castles can't control Scottish territory.
He sees castles very much as the focus of the English conquest of Scotland.
He did not see the point in wasting manpower holding castles.
And certainly, as king, the idea of these garrisons held against him seems to have really riled him.
So he would torch the habitations inside and around the castles. He would knock down the walls and just make them no use.
He's picking off parts of the chessboard that he can control. Basically, he fills in the squares all over Scotland.
Bruce, by the spring of 1313, is King of Scotland, essentially.
Finally, all that stands between Bruce and a united Scotland is one keep: Stirling Castle.
It's basically a lump of basalt in the middle of a marsh. And if you're going to go north or south in Scotland, and if you're going to go east or west, you've got to go past Stirling. It's the brooch that holds Scotland together. If you're going to control Scotland, you've got to get Stirling Castle.
Stirling Castle sits at a strategic bottleneck. It's perched above a stream whose name flows through history: the Bannock Burn. The castle is governed by Philip Mowbray, a Scot with English loyalties.
Robert Bruce has got to make sure that Edward II has got no castles available to him. And Robert Bruce does this by sending his most trusted people to go into these castles, open the gates, or even lay siege to these castles and reduce them so that there are no English castles left in Scotland. Edward, brother of Robert Bruce, is sent to Stirling because Robert can trust Edward to look after his own interests. Robert trusts Edward more than any other subordinate because Robert and Edward share the name Bruce. They're from the same household, and they both want exactly the same thing, which is to see Robert as King of Scotland.
Edward Bruce is expected to take Stirling Castle, regardless of how it happens. If you look at what Sir Thomas Randolph are doing and what Sir James Douglas have done, the castles have fallen left, right and centre, those guys. So, of course, Edward Bruce has got the monumental task of taking the most important castle in Scotland.
Three months into the siege of Stirling Castle, Edward Bruce begins to doubt whether the castle will ever fall.
What would you do?
I have a duty to my brother.
and my king, and I won't hesitate to make war. But this kind of terrible winning, 7 years of hell.
You can win this castle. With time. Starve them out.
But it won't win the peace and truce of God.
Knights, once vowed to protect and serve.
Edward is a good knight. Edward is trustworthy. Edward is somebody Robert Bruce can rely on, but Edward is not a good general. Edward doesn't understand politics.
But are we against evil? Or are we a part of it?
When Edward has got the garrison of Stirling Castle starved to the point of surrender, he does not take the castle the way Robert Bruce would have, the way James the Black Douglas would have. He makes a chivalric bargain.
It's St. John's Eve, a midsummer celebration, a night of magic and superstition in medieval Scotland.
Merry St. John's Eve, good night. Bones for the fire.
I thought you may have brought me the keys to the castle.
Let's walk.
Time's on my side.
It's 10 years since King Edward took this castle.
We'll have it back.
It took the king himself, with 12 siege engines and the great Warwolf trebuchet bombarding Greek fire and stone, 4 months to break this castle and 30 men. You have nothing.
I have time.
Then you'll need food and dragons.
And these fires will keep them away.
Can you speak for Robert?
It's my army. It's my country. It's my king.
Then by the Knight's Code, I propose a pact.
I think Edward Bruce saw it as a means by which he could achieve success without having to lose any of his men.
Both sides agree to stop fighting for now. The English have 1 year to resupply the castle. If no reinforcements arrive by next St. John's Day, Mowbray will surrender the fortress without a fight. But if the English meet the deadline, the Scots will end their siege.
If the English king cannot send an army to relieve Stirling Castle by Midsummer's Day, 1314, then the English will give up Stirling Castle and walk away.
This simple handshake seals the fate of nations. Mowbray and Edward Bruce think they've bought a year's peace. But the truce will backfire. Robert the Bruce's brother has just agreed to halt his bloody siege of Stirling Castle.
Then by the Knight's Code, I propose a pact.
The English get 1 year to restock, resupply, and reinforce the fortress. If they don't meet the deadline, they'll hand Stirling over to the Scots without a fight.
Oh, what have you done?
Robert Bruce was not best pleased with his brother Edward.
Damn you.
He perhaps sees it as forcing his hand in a way he wouldn't have chosen himself.
Bruce knew that Edward II was going to march, that he was going to advance with probably the biggest army that the Scots had ever seen.
Robert the Bruce sees the deal for exactly what it is. A clock ticking down to war. So far, the Bruce's success against the English have come from ambush and surprise.
The English would have regarded him as we would have regarded terrorists today.
Robert Bruce is really good at going out and beating people up if they're defenseless. Robert Bruce, whose entire hold over Scotland is based on his ability to avoid pitched battles, has got to fight an English army in the open in the field. Philip Mowbray, the governor of Stirling Castle, is given safe conduct to go to England and tell King Edward II that he's got a year to get an army together and bring it to Scotland.
Edward II had tried quite often to raise an army and engage the Scots, but he was facing so much criticism from his own barons and earls. I think a crucial part of the politics of all this is that Edward II had been in for a lot of criticism back home. He was often described as cowardly and unwilling to fight the Scots and face up to responsibilities.
What have you done?
I've resupplied and secured Stirling Castle for a year, without any loss of life.
Then what?
We bring an army north to relieve the castle. We reinforce and rearm by ship by St. John's Day, and we...
They'll never come. And if they do, they'll never survive the field.
I think once Edward II knows the situation and once he understands the agreement that's been made between the two parties, then it is the gauntlet has been thrown down. He has to respond.
You will not have to fight. Just reinforce.
We'll bring the vicious Welshmen with their knives. When the Bruce runs, they will hunt him like dogs. And we'll have the Irish approach from the west. And what Scots really support him. He'll either stand and fight our knights or be slaughtered by his own kind.
There is probably a sense of great urgency once the news comes in that the pact has been made.
Edward Bruce would have come to his brother and said, look, I failed at the siege, but I struck a deal with Mowbray. And I imagine Bruce would be livid.
We can have a bloodless surrender of the castle.
Edward's army will come. It will nae be bloodless.
But we've kept the bridge open. We've kept the peace.
We're nae here to keep peace. We're here to do battle. We're fighting for our kingdom.
Our brothers are killed.
While we twiddle here, our women are caged like animals. Our land is locked, and that wretched fortress is the key.
But we don't have to fight.
We do! We could have fought a few starving soldiers in that fortress. Now we'll face the best army Edward can raise. Start the work. Make pacts only with me. We'll fight, and we'll win enough hostages to bargain back our family.
Chivalry binds Bruce to his brother's pact.
It's a singularly bad plan.
The fortress is intact, well supplied and supported by Edward's army.
They've overcome in 30 nights. Now face 3,000 on their tubs.
He's your brother.
Chivalry says that you'd go out to battle, and rather than just slaughter until you've got all the power you want, there is a right as well as a wrong about killing. Chivalry is a way that medieval people who need to use violence to keep order and achieve power can do so in a way that is culturally acceptable. Edward II expects to march north with an army of a lot of heavy cavalry, and because the Scots have not got the mighty cavalry arm that the English have, the English will make mincemeat of a Scottish army. Then Edward II will be able to ride ceremoniously to relieve Stirling Castle.
Edward starts to plan the invasion of Scotland, and it is an invasion of Scotland. It's not only dealing with Bruce, it's about restoring his father's dream, basically, his father's ambitions, which have been passed to him.
Edward wants to raise an army to finish Bruce once and for all.
Letters are sent out to every sheriff and every lord to summon the troops for a certain date. He calls out knights and his lords, his barons, but also calls out the feudal host. And so that should represent all men between the ages of 16 and 60. And that includes troops from Wales, it includes troops from Ireland. At various points, it includes knights from the continent.
Remember, there was no standing army in those days. You had to raise it from scratch.
The young king commands none of the respect his father did. Several lords refused to commit any men at all.
Edward II, at this point, is a terribly unpopular king. His friends have made him unpopular. His ability to make enemies among powerful noblemen is astonishing.
Edward II is supposed to have summoned something like 29,000 men for the Bannockburn campaign. They don't all turn up. And indeed, not all of his nobles turn up.
Do they do as they're told, or do they do as they like?
Concessions have been made.
Lancaster is the largest landowner in the kingdom. He should owe the king's host 100 knights.
The English are just so darn fed up of war.
He calculates 4, Your Grace, and 4 lesser horsemen.
Edward I fought in Wales, he fought in France, he fought in Scotland, and with Edward II, the English might moan that he's letting all his dominions, go to the dogs, but they're quite happy not to pay for it.
Robert has got a year to pull an army together and turn it from a guerrilla army capable of striking from the forest and then melting away by night into an army capable of facing a big, powerful Anglo-Norman army.
Through the winter and spring, Robert continues to wage war against Edward's forces in Scotland. Robert's men loot and destroy. 6 more castles fall.
So around Easter of 1314, Robert takes his army, brings it together from all of its various sources, and he's got to teach them how they can beat knights. And the way that they can beat knights is by being convinced that if they stick together as a bunch of Scottish foot with big pikes in their hands, the knights can't kill them.
Skilled knights on horseback have dominated medieval combat for centuries.
This is a period of transition in terms of medieval warfare. Things are changing now. Infantry armies, thinking carefully about how they're going to match cavalry. Using rivers, using bridges, using anything, digging ditches, making the terrain work for you.
They dug trenches and then re-turfed them on top. When the cavalry came towards them, first thing they did was get into this ditch. Knight is down, can't stand up, he's dead too.
Once he's off his horse, a knight is trapped by his own heavy armor.
If he could get rid of the knights, if he could overcome that particular problem, then he had a chance.
The Scots could get an almost unlimited number of spears, thousands of them, give them to ordinary Scottish farmers and crofters, and turn them into capable soldiers.
Each man would be armed with a 12-foot spear, and it's heavy-tipped at the top, and possibly an axe or a dirk as well to finish the job.
You had these pikes arranged facing outwards.
You can literally put the spear butt against your foot so that it doesn't move, and so that when the enemy horse comes at you, it stays planted.
Okay, men? Children!
Robert's plan is to use foot soldiers with spears
Back up!
in ancient battle formations called schiltrons.
They're only weapons if you use them together. They're pikes, no plum tree shakers. Again, children!
Robert has got to convince people who've been conditioned from birth to fear the Anglo-Norman knight that as long as they hold together, each man standing beside his buddy, they're not going to get killed.
Stiffen them up. Back row, up. High. Okay, back up. One more time, just like that.
Schiltrons have been used defensively for centuries.
Good.
But the Bruce has a new trick up his sleeve.
What makes this completely different is the Schiltron walks. It's mobile, it moves quite quickly.
Now, as you can imagine, giving men a pointy stick and then asking them to walk with them is highly dangerous to your own side, if they are not disciplined and well trained.
If you've got a bunch of guys with pikes in a circle, it's going to take a bit of organisation to move them. Once they decide to park themselves, that's okay.
Obviously, they will then drop down to repel a cavalry charge, but they can then be moved around the battlefield to where Bruce wants them. So that's what is the essence of Bruce's strategy for Bannockburn, and it is, again, something that the English will never have seen.
Bruce's new mobile spear units aren't a secret for long.
There is a talk of a female spy. They're feeding back intelligence to Edward II as well. So he has a key element of spies as well. And it's amazing what you can pay with coin, what you'll get.
So, the north is mine for the taking?
King Edward's arrogance deafens him to any word of the Scots' plans.
His men worship him.
He's no king.
As long as he keeps taking your castles with simple tricks, people will keep laughing and believing he is King of the North.
The bright Scotch will join my army. Now, tell me of their camp.
He must have thought, well, this is not going to be such a big deal. I've got this huge resource behind me here. We know from our intelligence, from our spies and so on, that Bruce cannot possibly match our numbers. And traditionally in medieval battles, it was fairly straightforward. The guys with the most numbers won.
Even without the full support of his nobles, the English king will have the numbers on his side. But will they get there before the truce expires? If he wants to crush Robert the Bruce once and for all, England's king must get an army to Scotland before a truce keeping the peace expires. Despite the resistance of his nobles, Edward II assembles 20,000 men. Only 2/3 of the troops he wanted, but he still believes it will be enough to terrify the Scots, forcing them into retreat.
When Edward II marched up here, he was at the head of what I think is maybe the largest army England had ever assembled.
And it's all going to be very grand because medieval armies were very good at making an aggressive show at times like this. A lot of armor, a lot of banners, a lot of color, and a lot of brag.
This was a massive expedition. I mean, one chronicler said that it was 20 miles long, the procession, as this army moved forward. It was 20 miles from end to end.
One thing is certain. The English will outnumber the Scots. But getting there in time will take a terrible toll on the English troops.
Midsummer's almost there. The time's really up against him in terms of relieving it by Midsummer's Day. So the English army are pretty much tired as well.
There's a definite sense that just before the Battle of Bannockburn, the English foot soldiers in particular are pretty knackered because of the rate at which they've had to march in order to meet the deadline.
The massive army approaches Stirling with no time to spare. The castle is surrounded by forests. The Scots could be anywhere.
And the English army marches into the Tor Wood, following the road to Stirling. And the shadows of the wood fall on the English army. And the wood is hilly, the wood is dark, and there are signs all around them of the Scottish army that has just moved out of the Tor Wood. The English soldiers are going to get a feeling that a Scots army is somewhere just out of sight. The Scottish army is doing what it does best. It is avoiding combat. It is avoiding pitched battle. And it is trying to shape the battlefield, the battle space where they'll be fighting, to be what they want it to be.
The Scots are about to get their first look at the largest English army ever assembled. Bruce's men are outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time.
He could have 2,000 knights, 20,000 foot.
Or less.
Aye, or more.
In saecula saeculorum.
Just a few hundred yards separate the two armies as they make their final preparations at Bannockburn.
I have been told the English army is made up of men who speak 6 different tongues. Their soldiers are unknown to one another. It is a slender task I lay upon you. That each of you slay 2 men from Edward's army. You will then have killed 45,000. The scouting party reports the English army is weak. Already in disarray. Yes! Still, if there is anyone here without the stomach for a fight, he should leave now. Our enemies are moved only by a desire for domination. We are fighting for our lives, our wives, our children, and the freedom of our country.
He told them that they had right on their side. Because after all, it was a tyrannical English king that was the invader here.
The English have arrived in time to reinforce the castle.
Your Grace.
This concludes your fool's pact.
My pact was for peace.
One king and one land is peace. Two kings in one land is war.
Sir Philip Mowbray tells Edward II that technically the castle's been relieved, but Edward II goes, well, sort of, and? That's, yes, of course it is, but we didn't come all this way just to walk back again.
According to the pact, both Bruce and Edward's armies are now to stand down. But neither king is here to negotiate peace.
Just seeing the Scots army at the edge of some trees and seeing their enemy right in front of them, that's a goad. It draws the English forward. It draws the English into a battle space that the Scots have carefully prepared.
The Scots schildtrons block any escape through the forest. Side roads are barricaded with fallen trees. Potholes and booby traps line the edges of the roads.
We see the Scots are still acting the part of the guerrilla army, using all of its advantages against the overwhelming conventional power of the English knight.
It's quite clear that Robert Bruce has a strategy that is very much about making sure that the English horse go where he wants them to go.
Once the English knights enter the battlefield, there's no turning back.
We'll halt here to deliberate.
Edward and Robert are well prepared.
Prepared to run into the hills and forests.
It's very hard to know whether there was a plan for what the English did or whether certain groups of the English just decided that they were going to engage with the Scots.
Take reinforcements back to the castle. We have this in hand.
There is division amongst the English leaders as to who actually should have command. Smaller English force under Clifford and Beaumont are riding round the side to try and just bypass the Scots.
Thomas Randolph was with the main Scottish army. Left his Shiltram about a mile or so away.
What's he doing? Mowbray has safe passage.
The English knights are moving and almost seem to be outflanking Bruce. Bruce commands Thomas Randolph to go in and engage against Clifford's forces.
See, Randolph! There is a rose fallen from your chaplet! Oh, thoughtless man!
Bruce spots them riding round and says to Thomas Randolph, hang on a minute, you're going to effectively let them get through because you're not with your men.
You have permitted the enemy to pass!
Thomas Randolph scurries back down to his men.
They're basically met by Sir Thomas Randall's mobile schultron.
Disordered nature of the English cavalry attack means there's no focal point. The horses are just throwing themselves almost against the schiltrons with the spears pointing outwards. You have a slaughter of horseflesh, knights knocked to the ground. And the English are not able to make any headway against the Scots, who remain fixed and unbreakable.
I think, again, what it makes perfectly clear is that Bruce's strategy, his great innovation here, is working.
What we see is the opening of a battle of traditional knights on their horses in their armor against a lightly armored and more nimble foe. That is a metaphor for the entire war.
The schiltron's success thrills the Scots and draws out the full force of the English army.
The English army moves through the Tor Wood and comes out into some open ground. And this is the first time that the Scots have a picture of the English army. The whole Scottish army sees the avant-garde, the vanguard of the English army move out of the wood.
The truce that kept peace for a year is shattered, just one day before it was set to expire.
The real element that makes Bruce a hero, gives him his legendary status, is the encounter between him and the young knight de Bohun, Sir Henry de Bohun.
Henry de Bohun, the English knight, spots Robert Bruce overseeing the movement of his forces and sees an opportunity to attack the king and perhaps kill him and end this right here and now.
Henry de Bohun sees a chance of immortality.
And so he charges across the battlefield at Bruce.
He sees this thundering great beast coming towards him.
Axe! Yeah! Yeah!
Bohun, in his finery, in his armour, on his large destrier, charging across the battlefield, lance in hand. Bruce, on the other hand, he only has an axe to defend himself.
Axe! Yeah! Yeah!
Robert Bruce sees the man coming in his strong barrel helm, his chain mail reinforced with iron plate, on a massive destrier, thundering towards him at a hand gallop, almost as fast as the horse could go. The lance point coming down to point at his breast. And Robert Bruce takes advantage of his horse's mobility, just as he always took advantage of his army's mobility, swings his axe, and smashes Henry de Bowen's face in two. The axe went through the helmet, went through the head, and left Henry de Bowen dead. When Robert had killed Henry de Bowen, he turned to those beside him, looking ruefully at the haft of his axe, and said only that that horrible English knight had smashed a perfectly good axe with his horrible English face.
You've ruined your axe.
Aye. But made my day.
Could have had you on the end of his lance. This is not a game for kings. Let the army fight.
Aye. It is time.
In the English camp, news of the day's defeat is slow to trickle in.
Well, on the night of the first day, Edward's probably being told everything's going well. I think that's the problem with kings. People were kind of scared to say to them, hey, we're in trouble here.
I think the English nobility and the king himself, of course, couldn't conceive that it would be anything other than victory for their army.
English morale is already low. Then, just before dusk, Edward orders everyone and everything to be moved across the river. It's a panic to make the massive move before dark.
It's not surprising that people got covered in mud and gore and everything. People's shoes rotted and fell off. They broke their legs slipping in this dreadful stuff. I think everybody was probably indistinguishable from the mud that they were walking in.
The truce means nothing now. Robert the Bruce always knew it would come to this.
The Scottish army was hidden by wood, and the English army was very much out in the open. And as the English maneuvered into position through the night, instead of getting a good night's sleep, they must have been conscious of how exposed they were, as they asked themselves whether the Scots would fight.
The stories are that the English were particularly uncomfortable. There was a lot of noise going on. Some of the Welsh imbibed a bit too much and made a racket, started fighting amongst themselves. And I think that these guys, who were far from home, would be saying, well, if we were at home now, we'd be having a celebration. They may not have been able to celebrate as they would like, but I think they tried to have a little bit of a party. Because if you were hanging out near the king anyway, I don't think you thought you had too much to worry about.
On the eve of battle, the English king still believes the Scots will retreat without a fight.
To tomorrow we'll show King Hob our force, then spend the rest of the summer chasing him through the Highlands.
The king has done well to relieve the castle as promised.
By the letter, at least.
Tomorrow is a Saint's Day.
And we'll celebrate with victory.
If victory is chasing Hobb's men all over.
What is your purpose, Gloucester?
I just mean we should stay camped on the Saint's Day, regain our strength.
No, you didn't mean to say that. Because only a traitor or a coward would spoil our glorious victory of watching Hob Brown on St. John's Day.
You have an utter arrogance within the English camp that just turning up and being English against these pathetic Scots is bound to win the day. And again, this is part of the problem.
That arrogance alienates King Edward's troops and breeds treachery.
We know that a Scots knight who'd been, Alexander Seton, who'd been with the English and fighting with the English, is so disgusted by the amount of arguing going on, by some of the panic that may have been going on, and just the disunity, that he decides enough's enough. And he then goes over to Robert Bruce.
Are you the English army?
I'm Seton of Dunbar. I'm here to counsel the king.
He deserted the English army and came up to Bruce's camp and told him that English morale was very low, that there was a complete lack of strategy, and that no one really seemed to be fully in charge.
The English are dispirited, they've suffered defeat on the first day, they're uncomfortable because they're in a bog, they're lying there in their armour because they fear attack during the night. This is your opportunity, this is your chance, now or never, to defeat the English on the battlefield.
With the day's victory under his belt, Robert could retreat into the night and avoid fighting the English head-on. But news of the English morale makes him reconsider.
We can take our winnings and head for the Lennox Hills. Edward's army may follow, as they will, but by summer's end they'll fade like the leaves. We can return and level the castle then.
Edward has but the illusion of an army. Join him in battle tomorrow. Have victory for all time. Cut off my head and pull out my guts if it is not so.
Robert has been fighting for 8 years, living like an animal. His family are hostages. He cannot be an outlaw king forever.
The dilemma faced by Robert Bruce was melt away, claiming victory, or stay and fight, cementing victory.
You've got to be a winner, and sometime or other you've got to get rid of this threat, because otherwise what's going to happen is the English will just send in another army year after year until they wear us down. So maybe this is the point at which we make a stand.
And maybe for Robert Bruce, this is an opportunity to get his family back, to get his life back, and to kick the English king in the teeth and make sure that the English don't come back over that border.
It's horrible in the English army, absolutely horrible.
So you've got to imagine a night of misery, of men accustomed to probably being pavilioned in really quite luxurious tents on campaign, certainly the aristocrats, having to sleep by their war horses and sinking up to their knees in mud and mire. This is not how I think they wanted the opening moves of the second day of the battle to be. The English army is demoralised.
And it's going to get worse.
Robert has made his decision. He will stand and fight. Capture the English nobleman, negotiate his family's freedom, or die trying. The Scottish poet Robert Burns crystallizes this moment in verse 4 centuries later. Scots who have with Wallace bled, Scots whom Bruce has often led, welcome to your gory bed or to victory.
Douglas. Kneel, knight. Your father died in Wallace's service. Since we met on the road to the throne, you have fought with me in the woods. You took Douglas Castle. You took Roxburgh Castle. Now, my good and faithful servant, take this. You have been faithful to me in these things. Now, I will make you master over many.
On the morning of the second day of the battle, Bruce knights James. He becomes the good Sir James Douglas.
From this day, so you might win back your lands and avenge your family, I name you Knight Banneret. Well done. Go, knight, and lead your men into battle under your own banner.
This was a chivalric convention that men were knighted on the eve of battle or on the morning of battle. And the idea was that they would fight with greater ferocity, with greater valor, to win the accolade of knighthood they'd just received.
Now we kneel to the fate of he to whom we are all servant.
Look, they kneel to beg our forgiveness before they flee.
The English saw the Scots kneeling and thought they were begging for mercy.
And Edward goes, ha! Look, they're kneeling. To me, they're surrendering.
But of course they weren't.
They're asking to forgive their trespasses for what they're about to do.
It's time for glory or the grave.
The Scottish Army, there is big debate about how many divisions the Scottish Army actually comprised. Most historians now would say that there were 3 divisions.
The Scottish Army appears to come forward with 2 battles, as they're described, the 2 main schiltrums, perhaps at a slight angle so they don't end up colliding, and then Bruce's schiltrum in the rear, so he can orchestrate things from that position. The English do seem to be cavalry to the front and then infantry to the rear. The English position is hindered by the fact that they're surrounded by unhelpful topography.
It is a peat bog. It has pools of water, it has very rough, tussocky ground. It is impossible almost for the English horses to go at any speed on such ground. They could not manoeuvre at all.
8,000 Scots amass on the forest edge. Between them and Stirling Castle stand 20,000 Englishmen. An army bigger and better equipped. Everyone expects surrender. Everyone except the Scots.
My assessment is that the English did not expect the Scots to fight, and the English were preparing for an almost ceremonial battle deployment and a march to Stirling Castle.
Bruce prepares his men. They will split into 3 schiltrons, commanded By Bruce, Randolph, and Edward Bruce. It's at this point, as they start to come through the wood, it's slowly but surely that the English realise that the Scots are going to fight.
If Robert Bruce does not effectively destroy Edward II's army, then Robert the Bruce will give up the opportunity to make sure the English don't come back for years.
On them! Go forward and battle like knights!
In the opening minutes of the battle, Edward Bruce's Schiltron is first to come under attack.
They form up their shield walls with their spears. And the English would never before have seen a Scottish army forming a shield wall and moving towards them.
The pikes could do desperate damage to a knight. And once a knight was unhorsed, he was helpless because he wore too much armour to be able to stand up.
The Scots begin to move forward, and this is really the vital part of the Battle of Bannockburn. Horseflesh meets the pikes. There are screams, men dying, horses dying. The Schiltrons eventually all form together onto one mass and start pushing forward.
And the Scots spearmen pushed those spear points into horses and into knights and started moving towards the English main body. For the first time in Great Britain, in the Middle Ages, a spear formation, an infantry formation, was cutting up wealthy, well-equipped, well-motivated knights. And the English didn't know what to do.
The Battle of Bannockburn erupts into a sea of mayhem, gore, and horseflesh.
On them!
Armored medieval knights slaughtered by angry peasants with pointy sticks. 8,000 Scots dismantling 20,000 of the best troops England can muster.
The English heavy cavalry charge should have been unstoppable. It always worked.
So what you're actually then starting to see is the Scots trying to move the English back. And of course that means that they're pressing into the guys behind them and they can't move any further forward.
There are one or two kind of key points in that battle. One is the fact that it's the English cavalry that leads the charge on the Scottish Schiltrons. It is essentially a replication of the previous day with the same result. The English cavalry are incapable of breaking through the Scottish Schiltrons.
The English are on their heels, but they're not finished yet. Their archers begin raining down hell.
According to one chronicle, there is an engagement between the Scots archers and the English archers, where the bowmen release their arrows and the Scots release theirs.
At which point, Bruce orders the Earl Marshal, Roy Keith, to attack with his light cavalry, and they succeed in scattering the English archers. So that crucial element in English tactical thinking fails at this critical battle.
The tide has turned. The English have nothing left.
The Scots stood up and started to do the work of slaughter. The English are no longer fighting the Scots.
On them! They fail! On them!
They're fighting for their own lives.
the majority of the English nobility are killed at that point. What seems to have turned the battle is the introduction of what to the English appears to be a second army, but is traditionally called in Scotland the small folk.
And they think it's a fresh division of troops.
Many of these are probably actually men who've turned up to join Bruce's army within the last few days. And then you've got all the rest of the camp followers, the women and the children or whoever have been in the camp. And they seem to have heard that things are going well and have charged down from wherever they were stationed to join in. This is the last straw for the English.
So the English start to sort of run away. They start to desert or move off as quickly as they can.
When you see the men around you running, I think the temptation would be to run as well, and that is the beginning of the end.
The English trample and crush their own in the panic of the retreat.
For the English, the battle was a catastrophe. It was the first major defeat they had suffered at the hands of the Scots for centuries.
It's interesting that the English seem to have been incapable of organising themselves properly, and whether that's a fault in Edward II's leadership or his commandos, but they don't seem to be prepared when the Scots come onto the battlefield.
They grabbed Edward II's reins of his horse and pull him off the battlefield.
Very reluctantly, he allows himself to be led away.
Edward II flees with his hide intact. Thousands of his countrymen lie dead in the battlefield.
It's a classic case of how not to organise a major battle, and it reflects very poorly on Edward's command abilities.
Not even Stirling Castle can offer refuge to the humbled monarch.
If the battle is lost and this castle falls, now or in days.
I am your king!
Is the battle lost? Then this castle is nothing more than a cage for our king. Fly to the sea now, or watch him fall.
This is the war Robert never wanted. And what has he won? The Bruce's destiny comes at an incredible cost. His family slaughtered and enslaved. Hunted at every turn for a decade. But now, he's pushed back the English. He has his crown. And with hostages from the battle, he can reclaim his family.
The English prisoners, of which there are various high-ranking English lords, most notable of whom is the Earl of Hereford. Bruce is able to trade Hereford for his wife, his daughter, his sisters, and so rescue those who are closest to him.
From inside the walls of Stirling Castle, Mowbray realizes he's on the wrong side of history.
Well, Mowbray has obviously witnessed what's happened in the battle. He then surrenders the castle to Bruce. In return, the English garrison themselves probably given a safe code of conduct to go home. Mowbray himself becomes Bruce's man. He swears an oath of fealty to Bruce.
In material terms, there's an enormous loss to the English. The English army travelled with a large baggage train. The nobles bring their rich tents, they bring their tableware of silver and gold, their plate, sometimes their jewels. This is an aristocracy showing off its wealth on campaign. Of course, all of that falls into the hands of the Scots.
This was a real humiliation for Edward II. He'd had a hard push to even get an army together to go and take Scotland, and he has been defeated.
The English king's retreat must have been bitter and lonely. The losses at Bannockburn form an eternal bloody stain on the legacy of Edward II. Back in England, his enemies are closer to home.
He's overthrown by his wife.
Now, his wife, Isabella, who is sick of him by this time, she arranges for his assassination in such a way that there are no marks on his body, so there's no suspicion.
So eventually, Edward is deposed and put to death in a rather nasty fashion, involving a hot poker, if you believe the traditional story. For Bruce, the Battle of Bannockburn is a great victory for him. He's not won the whole entire war. He has to still go and fighting for another 14 years. But what Bannockburn does is it creates him as the undisputed King of Scots.
Bruce realised that he had to now set about the reconsolidation of his kingdom. It is not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we're fighting, but for freedom alone, which no honest person will lose, but with life itself.
From murderer to monarch, from condemned man to King of the Scots, Robert the Bruce's victory at Bannockburn forces the world to recognize Scotland as a free nation.
Bruce is accepted as king by the English. The border is where the border is.
Bannockburn matters because it was a colossal victory against the odds. For as long as 100 of us remain alive, we shall never surrender. This is inspirational stuff. That idea, I think, is transmitted to posterity. Battles and wars are not just won through weaponry, they're won through ideas. The idea that just as the subjects have to respect the king has to respect the subjects. It's a mutual contract.
One king earns his crown. Another king is brought to heel. A nation is forged, free and independent for centuries to come. A legend is born.